Welcome to #EventIcons, where you get to chat with the icons of the events industry. I am Alex Plaxton, your host today, and my co-host is the lovely Lindsay Martin Dobre. And today we're talking about something very important, something that we're all really excited about, 2020 business trends and forecasts, and what they mean for events with the expert, Mike Dominguez. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me, and excited to be with you guys. This is fun.
Awesome. Well, let's get to it.
It's Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, so you know what that means. It's time for another episode of #EventIcons.
Presented by Endless Events.
The show where you get to ask the icons of the events industry anything.
Just go to www.event-icons.com to ask questions.
Our iconic guests will answer them live during the entire show. Before we get started, the more people we have watching, the better the conversation. So please help share #EventIcons
on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just tell your friends to watch at www.event-icons.com.
Now, without any further delay, this is #EventIcons.
So, Mike, you are the president and CEO for ALHI, the Associated Luxury Hotels International. Tell us a bit about your experience in the past. This is your first time on Event Icons. So we always ask a question, how did you get in the events industry? And you have quite the resume. So I don't think we're going to have time to get into every single thing you've done, but tell us a little bit about your experience, how you came up in the industry, and if you weren't in the industry, what would you be doing?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm one of those that from people that have been in the industry a long time, I think our story's kind of common. We're here by accident. Seriously, I literally had no intention of being in this industry. When you've seen me present, one thing that'll probably make sense is I was coming through the programming and math route. I was very much a math major. Was going to be an engineer at one point. So math, data makes a lot of sense to me, and it's very, very organic and natural for me. But literally in school, I was working with Hyatt hotels, and I started in this industry bussing tables and was bussing tables at a Hyatt on the weekends. My mother wouldn't let me work during the week. I could only work on the weekends, anything that didn't interfere with school. And when I graduated school, as I was going to college, realized that I went from bussing tables to waiting tables to supervising a restaurant within 6 months, had my first management job within about 9 months after that, and then started to move, and you realize that there was an industry. And where I'm really encouraged is our industry today has so many hospitality schools and programs around the country. That's not the same fight that we had 20 to 30 years ago. But that was pure accidental. I think what surprises most people is I started in operations. I was a food and beverage person for literally 9 years before.
You present really thinks it's that would surprise them, because you always start with food and beverage about how it's a hard cost and you just shouldn't.
Fair point. You know, it's I'm the guy that the margin actually matters, you know, and it really
not here.
You really do pay attention to it. But that was an interesting part. I started in operations, and I often in this industry talk about people you come in contact with and how your life will pivot. And I call them inflection points, but I was transferred to a hotel, and literally I was inducted into the Hall of Leaders. And I invited the person that was most instrumental for me being in sales to that event with me. And he is one of my mentors. His name is Brad Poncher, and used to be in Hyatt's worldwide sales with Gary Sane back in the day. Him and Gary were great friends, and Gary's an industry icon for sure, that we lost a few years ago. But Brad happened to be the general manager at this hotel as I came in to run food and beverage, and he's the one who pulled me into sales. He's the one that, because of his sales background, said, "Why aren't you doing sales?" And I had no idea what this discipline was or what it meant. And I was the person that I was always going to be the general manager by the time I was 30, and I would have been an operational VP and would have been operating buildings. I would have never thought about sales. And once I got down into the sales path, it became very much a hook for me. And then, the interesting part is when you talk about really getting involved in the meeting and events industry and getting involved in the industry, it took somebody asking me. I was just minding my own business and doing my job. And I had somebody that asked me to be part of the MPI leadership group for Southern California chapter. And that was the start of my industry volunteerism and the addiction I have of being in the industry. And, and you asked me, what would I be doing otherwise? I would have been teaching. I always wanted to be a teacher. And I don't think that's a surprise when you see me present. It's about education. It's about me always presenting education and or educational content. It's what I have a passion for. I have a passion of learning, understanding, and then trying to teach and have that dialogue. And that's kind of what gets me going. It really does get the drive moving.
I love that. It's funny because one of my staff members, I brought her to the Site Young Leaders Conference this year at IMEX America, and she was telling me about the program and talking about all the speakers. I was like, which one stood out? She goes, I can't remember his name, but he loved economic models. And man, he was on fire about everything, and he loved it. And about that time, Mike sat down in front of us on the airplane. She goes, that's the guy. I was in. She goes, he was amazing. I can't talk to him though. Can you introduce me? I was like, I don't know if he'll remember me, but heck yeah, let's do it. So the teacher thing, it's passing through. Your Padawans are listening.
Well, I appreciate it. And, it's funny. I have a new VP of marketing that I just brought in at Alhi, and she's worked with me in the past in a couple of different areas, but she was at the Scottsdale Bureau before coming over, and she said when they announced her job, she had a couple of people that came in to her and go, we didn't know you knew Mike. And she goes, Mike, you have a fan club. And I didn't know that. And she goes, and I had no idea until I took this job, because people said, wow, yeah, people actually know you. And it was fun, but more than anything, I always say it's given me an opportunity to have a platform to continue to educate and communicate. And that's the important part for me. I don't think enough people put context around the content. And that has always been my objective. You'll hear me say it often that we always say, you've heard for years that content is king. I believe in today's world, context is, not content. Because I can get content anywhere. I can Google or YouTube anything I need to learn. I need these discussions to be able to tell me, why is it important to me? What does it mean? And tell me how it's going to impact me both personally and professionally. And I think that's something I do well. It's just the way my brain works. There is no magic formula to it. It's just my natural curiosity, and everybody's hardwired a certain way. I'm just hardwired this way. It's where my brain goes. I read something in a paper, on a report, and all of a sudden I'm down a rabbit hole because I'm researching, and it's just the way my brain works. And it's not a bad rabbit hole. It actually excites me and it invigorates me, and I'm learning as I go. And then I think part of my responsibility is teaching what I've learned, or what I think I've learned. And I also think there's a maturity to teaching that I always tell people that it's important, because I've had people tell me in the past, it's important to get the truth on the table. And I said, yeah, but you always got to understand that it's your truth. And I think that's why we've lost civil discourse, is that we forget that it's your truth. There is not a truth. There is your truth, because no matter what the topic is, it's your perspective, it's your environment, it's your filter that is being brought to bear. And we sometimes forget that. And I joke that we all talk about diversity of thought, and we all believe in it until somebody disagrees with you. And then you don't like diversity of thought anymore. That's disappointing to me, because we should be able to have those conversations. And I do not fall into the camp of being offended because somebody has a different point of view.
Yeah.
And yet we've become a society that we seem so offended because somebody has a different point of view. That is something I keep impressing on people, because I think our industry, we're large enough and impactful enough and have enough tentacles that we can actually change a lot of the conversation, as long as we understand that, again, there is not a truth. There are multiple truths, because it is your perspectives, but how do we bring those multiple truths to the middle to try to get something done? And it's missing in Washington. It's missing in a lot of leadership roles because we've kind of lost that. But I think it's an important piece for us moving forward. And that's the teacher side of me. When I'm trying to teach, I'm always trying to remind everybody, look, there is different perspective, and you need to understand that. And you need to be able to get a broad perspective to truly learn. One perspective is not going to teach you.
Yeah. And I think that that's interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, Alex.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that that's interesting because it's one of the things we were talking a lot about with a lot of the experts who've been sharing about the 2020. And, you know, Stephanie Harris, who was at Amex for years and now she's at IRF, she came out and talked about the big report that American Express put out, and like, what is it, 80 pages worth. She said, but this year it's largely editorial because who wants to go through the Excel data? And I was like, me, but you know, I like editorial too. He was like, but it's really, really, it's positive on all of this. And then we had 3 more experts not an hour later come across the interview stand and say, ooh, I don't know. So when you're kind of looking at that, talking about all of the just general upheaval, I think is a good way to talk about 2019 and preparation for 2020. What do you think are the business trends we should be looking out for as event professionals?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I always tell people you got to read through the numbers today, and you have to dig a little bit further. That numbers that we've always looked at have a different historical perspective than they ever have. I would agree with Stephanie in that things look really positive for 2020. And when you look at everything that is coming in, even if we were to have a slowdown, and there is no economist even looking at a slowdown or a recession, they may be looking at a slowdown. I talk about we're bad with semantics. Any slowdown we are talking about is a slowdown in the rate of growth. Well, the key word there is we are still growing. We just won't be growing at the same rate we've been growing over the last 2 years. I think it's interesting because I was just watching CNBC, and one of the regional feds actually brought a GDP forecast up to 2%. We grew at 1.8% for a decade. To tell me we're going to grow at 2%, it's still really solid growth, especially with all the headwinds you see around the globe. And when I look at perspective and when I say things can't be looked at in the same universe as they have in the past. Let's say we even slowed down, and let's say we even had a recession, and the recession was as deep as 2019 or 2009. Here's the point. In 2009, household debt was at a record high. Household debt today is at a record low, all-time low in history, which means the consumer, which still drives 70% of our economy, has record low debt versus any other time in history, versus a record high when we fell off the cliff. The other point to make, the savings rate today with those same households is at a record dating back to 2000, while the savings rate was at an all-time low in 2009. So even if everything crashed right now, you have a consumer today with less debt, more savings. They have jobs. Unemployment's at an all-time record low. And you have more jobs than you have people. Wages are growing. Tell me what's bad in this scenario. And we tend to forget 70% of the U.S. economy is driven by the consumer. Yeah. And it is why, if you looked at Q3 earnings reports, 75% of all companies beat guidance for Q3 because all analysts were telling you it was going to be worse, and the consumer continues to surprise and impress what is happening. And you just saw that over the last couple of days when you see Walmart report, when you see Target report, the consumer is doing really well. And I think this is an environment that if there's anything I can talk about in 2020, and I think this became really alive in 2019, people need to be able to separate policy from politics and understand that, especially with us getting into an election year. And I think it's really critical that we understand that we no longer have journalists in the world today, we have media. We have people giving you a point of view versus reporting the news so that we can be in.
And that is, oops, sorry, that's me.
It's okay. I was like, oh no, that point felt very important.
Yeah, it really is. But it's an interesting one because I think Denzel Washington said it really well. He said, we no longer have news, we have opinion news. And that is where the world has kind of moved. And I think that makes it even a bigger responsibility. When I'm in the industry, I'm trying to teach. And I said, I'm not trying to teach a point of view. I'm trying to tell you what the realities are, because our media fails to do this, because they are all too intent on trying to give you a point of view. It's going to get worse in 2020. And if there's any negative in 2020, I think it's important for everyone to know that we're about to get into that environment in an election year where they're going to tell us how bad our world is, how miserable our lives are, and how we're about to hit Armageddon. And that happens during every election cycle over the last 20 years or so. And it's a real sad place for us to be, but it's the reality of where we are today. It's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. And I think it's important for us to be mature enough to know and be able to filter through that, because the environment's going to be really good. And the one thing I don't think people have talked enough about, our economy has been driving while nobody else has, especially in 2019 around the globe. You have issues in Europe. We have issues in Central America. China has had the slowest GDP they've seen in 25 to 30 years. And yet the US economy has been growing at a GDP rate we haven't seen in literally 15 years.
Yeah.
So why is that? A lot of reasons to it that would take the entire session here. But there are a few things behind it. One being the tax cut that we had in 2017, and it had to do with the repatriation tax and that money coming back into the US. And it's interesting that I always call it our flu shot. I said the world has an economic flu, and we got a flu shot in 2018. And 2018 was this injection of cash that came from the repatriation tax law. And I always ask people when I'm presenting, I've never had more than 5 to 6 hands go up, no matter how big the room is. But I always ask people, please raise your hand if you know what the repatriation tax is. I've never had more than 5 to 6 hands go up. And my answer is always consistent. If you don't know what that is, it is impossible for you to have an intelligent opinion about the tax bill. You'll have an opinion, it's just not intelligent. It is not well educated. And the reason for that, it was the most dramatic change in tax law we've seen in 40 years. And I usually show a clip from Tim Cook from Apple explaining why it was so critical. And his exact words were, in my opinion, this should have been changed long ago, but let's get this done now. Well, in its simplest form, the repatriation tax says, I'm a US company, I make money around the world. I've paid my taxes wherever I've earned it. I have profits sitting there. For me to bring that profit back to the United States and invest here, I have to pay a 40% penalty tax because I didn't earn the money here. That's just stupid. And there's a reason that money has not come back, because nobody is just going to give away 40% of their profit. And what does that mean? There's no tax receipts in the US. There's no investment in the US. How is that good for us as an economy? Well, the reason I say we got a tax or a flu shot, and again, our media has not been reporting this, but over the last decade, from 2000 to 2017, the average repatriated money coming back to the US has been $50 billion. I forgot to mention, there's $3 trillion in US profits sitting around the world. $50 billion has come back from 20 to 2017 each year. You know how much came back in 2018? $777 billion.
Wow.
That was our flu shot. And the one thing I remind everybody, that's 2/3 of the stimulus bill we passed in 2009 of $1 trillion to try to get our economy going. And that was all taxpayer funded. While this one is all company funded. And by the way, $777 billion coming back at a 15% tax rate means the government in taxes earned as well over $100 billion to the tax coffers. It's good for everybody. Yeah. Those are the things that we're not talking about, but those are the things that has kept us afloat. And the point I wanted to make is our economy continued to grow, and we've continued to do well with all these headwinds. And I think about it. You've got the trade war. We've got Brexit that hasn't been settled. Europe, in certain parts of Europe, we're in recession. You've got currency crisis in Latin America, South America. Again, you got China growing at its slowest GDP we've seen literally in 30 years. And the US has still been growing at this rate. Well, I think we're going to get the tariff thing done. So you don't have that headwind anymore. Yeah. Europe is starting to come out of recession. You don't have that headwind. Brexit should be resolved here in the next 90 to 120 days. Well, if we've had all these headwinds, I know, let's hope.
Right? I always want to cross myself when you say that.
It will get resolved. Put it this way, it will get resolved one way or another.
Very true.
going to get resolved. And,
Yeah.
and only thing that's ever bad for economic growth and for our industry is instability. Getting resolved one way or another is going to be good. And the point I've been trying to make, we've had all these headwinds. If those headwinds become tailwinds, right when we're supposed to be slowing down to 2%, we may grow better than 2% because they're not headwinds anymore. And I just don't think we take enough time to really study the data and study the numbers. You know, the jobs report that just came out for Q3, the report was we only created 128,000 jobs. Look, we slowed down because we had been averaging 185,000 new jobs. Well, you know what's missing in that number? 45,000 people that are pulled out of it because of a GM strike. It was a 1-month GM strike. It doesn't mean that number is going to stay. But if you add the 45,000, guess where you're at, where we've been.
Yeah.
And I forgot to mention the 21,000 people that came out of the workforce for the census that are no longer working. Those have to be added back in. And the reason those numbers get skewy, it was saying, well, we're a little bit slower. And you notice the markets didn't react because I think they understood it. But next month, I promise you, you're going to hear a jobs report that has a spike. And the spike's going to be because the 45,000 jobs are back in and the census jobs are back in. That's where we are right now as a society. We try to make the news more to our point of view versus saying, let's tell you what the number is and kind of what's building it. I see everything positive moving into next year. The only thing negative is that we have an election going on. And I will tell you, if history tells us anything, is literally that we'll probably tighten up in third and fourth quarter just a bit. And it has nothing to do with anything else except that we have an election and there's uncertainty around the election. Uncertainty is not really good for us and companies to make decisions. But the environment is really positive. Again, I agree with Stephanie. Everything is telling us out there it's positive. And I got to see a report from Adam Sachs, you know, with Oxford Economics, and he spoke at our U.S. Travel Board meeting. And what was really good about that, he's telling you, if you look at perspective of where we are as an industry, we are so far north of any highs that we had before that even if we slow down, we're going to be so much higher than any historical point we've ever seen, except for the last couple of years. That's what nobody's talking about. And, you know, and you've heard me say this in my presentations, we're occupying almost 67% of all guest rooms in the United States. 2008, that was our peak. Before we fell off the cliff, we were at 59%. We are 7 points higher, and think about how much bigger our industry is today than it was back in 08. We are so well situated to be able to withstand just about anything. And again, I think what's really healthy is that we have low debt consumers with high savings and really a lot of wealth in there. Unless we have a bank meltdown once again, everything's going to be fine. It'll be a traditional normal slowdown. One caveat I think that is out there is when we have a major slowdown, and we haven't talked about this, we are now in the largest expansion we've ever seen, economic expansion in U.S. history. It's now been more than 10 years. As a hotel industry, we are now in the largest expansion we've ever seen in our history by 1 month, but it's 1 month more than 1990 to 2000. The thing I think is interesting, if this has been the norm, anybody who is 35 or younger, they are going to freak out the first time we have a recession because they have only known and worked in their work life during the largest expansion in history. That's not the real world. It is a snapshot in time. Yeah. And that's not a criticism at all about millennial. My point is, it's just the reality. They've never seen the world be a cycle, and we will go through a cycle at some point, whenever that cycle is. And I'm always stressing this to our leaders because I think it's important that we're prepared to educate the people that are going to be in that group that the world's going to be okay. It's going to be a little chaotic. The average bear market only lasts 18 months. It's going to be a little chaotic, but take a deep breath. We're going to be fine. And I think that's an important piece, though.
So you mentioned something earlier that kind of struck me, which was that as an industry, we could be making a lot of positive change. And hearing all this information about kind of lack of education and just worry, it sounds like everyone's really worried, and it sounds like we shouldn't be. Is that what's holding us back from making all this positive change, or is it something else? Is it another trend that we need to be looking for?
No, I separate it into two buckets, Alex. It's the economically, that's where the uncertainty is. I think the positive changes, and I say this all the time, I think as an industry, because we're in every destination and we're so pervasive in the job and the tax markets in most destinations, we probably have the ability to have the largest impact on social change in the world if we could just get on the same page and unite. The challenge is, and we tend to do this, we tend to be all over the board with where the interest is. And I do think that's the issue. But as an industry, if we can start to say, look, if we're going to tackle, and I think this is interesting. I spoke at the Green Buildings Council's Summit. And they asked me to speak because, of course, that's all about sustainability that we all care about. And they know I care about that. But I was a counterpoint of view as I sat there and listened to a lot of people beat up cities and counties for not doing enough, states for not doing enough, and businesses for not doing enough. And what they asked me to speak to, and I said this, and I said it with a lot of belief, because I do believe this, is I fully believe in saving the planet, but let's not forget who we're saving it for. Because there are a lot of social people issues we need to be addressing as well as sustainability issues. And sustainability is not the end all. And there is a balance to this. And what I was started to speak to was, let's get to the reality of it. And I was showing the math, and not a surprise, I got to the math. And the math was simply, there is only so much money. Tell me what priority is most important. Because yes, you want this in sustainability, it costs money. And when you're beating up the counties and my whole point was to all of this, it's going to take private and public enterprises coming together to do this effectively. And I called BS on most of those people, and I will to most people that want to talk about, I believe in saving the planet and it's the most important thing. And I told them, if we're really going to save the planet, we'd be sitting in this meeting room where I was speaking. I said, we would be sitting in this meeting room and it would be 80 degrees and you would be very uncomfortable. But the moment you're uncomfortable, you no longer want to be sustainable. Because our air condition in these buildings, we'd be like Japan. Because every meeting I'm in Japan, I am sweating in the middle of summer because their buildings will not go cooler than 80 degrees. But that's being really sustainable. We want to be sustainable as long as it doesn't impact my comfort and as long as it doesn't impact me. And I told them, I said, you really want to save the planet? Great. Guess what? We're going to do everything sustainable in this hotel that we were at. And I said, but your registration fee is now $150 more and your room rate is $100 more because that's what I need to make it happen. And I go, and the moment I do that, you're no longer staying here and you're no longer registering for this conference. So that's where I call BS because we are very hypocritical when it comes to, it's what everybody else is doing wrong. Not saying, okay, I need to be a little more discomfort or I need to have a little more discomfort in my life if I'm really going to have the impact we want. And that's where I think we're missing the opportunity right now. That argument as far as a social point we can make and a social difference. To me, that's the conversation we should be having. Where's the money going to come from? Money doesn't grow on trees. And you've heard your parents say that, growing up, but there's a reality to it in businesses. There's only so much capital to be had. And there are so many needs, but it's hard for you to convince me that it's more important to make sure I'm not putting plastic straws in the ocean versus the human being that's sleeping on the street and doesn't have a place to sleep when we're having a very bad cold and snowstorm coming through the US right now. Yes. I think they're both just as important, but those aren't the conversations we're having. Like, how do we solve for both? And candidly, I get a little bit, not concerned, I get a little disappointed that we have more passion and aggravation about the sea turtles and saving them than we do the human beings that are sleeping in our streets. And it's not that I don't care about the turtles. My point is we should have just as much outrage and passion to solve that. But I don't see that kind of initiative going on. To say, what are we doing to homelessness? What are we doing to end hunger, in the States and around the world? But no, we have a documentary with a turtle and a straw or plastic stuck in it, and all of a sudden it's straws are the enemy and we've removed them everywhere. Why can't we have that same passion around some of the human social issues we have? That's kind of my messaging. And I want to say that, and it's hard for me because we don't like to have those kind of conversations. I'm not saying sustainability is not important, but I am saying there are other social issues that are just as important. So how do we come together and really start to make some sense out of it? That's what I meant by the.
You don't have to qualify it at all. You were exactly in the right place. I mean, it's funny, we've had this conversation with Jamie Murdoch. We've had it with Fiona. I mean, it seems almost it's a theme, really. Don't you agree, Alex, that almost every guest we've had in the last 6 to 9 months has been really focused around that. And I think the industry as a whole is taking baby steps forward. I know there's the sexual harassment pledge that was going out, the one around human trafficking that SITE and several others are pioneering, but it's never going to be enough.
Oh,
but
I think
getting there. Hopefully.
I think one of the things is looking at leaders in the industry, right? Like you look at Dreamforce that just happened and they didn't serve beef, right? There are 170,000 people at that event that probably made a big impact relative to the event. But is that now going to be a trend in 2020 that now all of a sudden everyone's not going to serve beef because Dreamforce didn't serve beef?
They didn't talk anything about the homeless that were there in San Francisco. There were 5 conferences happening in SFO last week. And it was always, I was sitting in 4 different meeting rooms and everyone's like, couldn't they have cleaned it up a little bit better down near whatever convention center we were, I mean, because some of it was Moscone and then we were in the Bay for part of it. And I was like, guys, we're the ones who help with that. It's not just their job. It's all of our jobs. And the beef thing, sorry. So
No, it's the important part. And I do think that there's so many, and it's a challenge because I do this without trying to look at criticism. I always try to look at it, how do you solve for it?
Yeah.
And the issues I see, it's a challenge that when you're a major membership organization, you have such a diverse group and a diverse interest, but we tend to play whack-a-mole. Because all of a sudden we've got this group and they're very interested in the Me Too. Got it. Okay, I'm working on that. Oh, here's the piece on trafficking and I'm working on that. Oh, here's the sustainability audience that's yelling at me to say, let me work on that. Here are the issues in the LGBT community that, okay, I got to work on that. My issue is we haven't prioritized it as an industry to say, let's take them one at a time. We're going to be doing the whack-a-mole no matter what. But let's all of us as an industry say we're going to target human trafficking. Then let's do that. And let's do it really well for 6 to 9 months to 12 months to get our feet under us so that we know it's sustainable. And then let's add another piece to the puzzle.
Yeah.
And then say, okay, we've got a really good network working on this piece. Now let's move to the next priority. I think that's what's missing in the industry because we have so many voices and there's so much noise, nobody's being heard. And if we could ever get the noise to be consistent as far as one voice, I think we could actually have the impact we're looking for.
I have a question. So while we're being contrarian, so do you think that some of those are...
Were we being contrarian? I didn't know that.
No, because it's interesting because
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
letting it back against a couple of conversations. And one of those is, why should it be our responsibility? Why should we be accountable for what someone else has broken? And other people are like, well, our money needs to be focused on, used membership organizations, on the missions of the membership. And our membership organization does this, or our company does this. Inside of that, these other things, they're kind of like the third rail, right? Yeah. So how do you argue that CSR just for industry's sake? Is it our job?
Well, it's, if we had that attitude, we wouldn't have CSR. Every company has CSR because we believe we have a social responsibility to the world. And it's not just, and what I am proud of is I think businesses are not only there, it's part of the core of businesses today. It's where I get irritated at times, again, going back to, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but our media and what comes out of Washington when they make them the big bad corporations. They forget how many people corporations employ, the insurance that they actually provide. And what's always misunderstood in that number is, you pay a premium working for a major corporation, but 90% of the premium is being picked up by the company.
Yeah.
that is the best form of healthcare we could have. Those are the pieces that I think if companies didn't understand that we have this responsibility to make the areas that we serve better, you wouldn't have CSR anywhere. And I think we had a massive, and I'm not trying to be too dramatic, it was a monumental turning point for us when Jamie Dimon, who was, heading up the CEO roundtable, which are the major corporations in the United States, and they're sitting around talking about initiatives. After this roundtable this year, he came up and said, corporate profits are no longer number one. That our ability to impact change and social change will be number one, with profits being second. The reason that's monumental, again, we talk out of both sides of our head, because the companies that are doing the best in sustainability, if they are sacrificing any piece of margin, they are literally being punished by the stakeholders for not driving better margin. Right. So when is the market actually going to reward companies for actually having that interest? Again, not to be that dramatic, but I think it was monumental, because literally for Jamie Dimon to step up and say that, Jamie Dimon is one of the loudest voices, one of the more respected voices, in corporate America. So for him to be able to make that statement, that was dramatic. And I think it's a turning point. If we fast forward 10 years, I think we'll be rewinding and looking at that as a turning point, where they were making a statement to analysts and investors and stakeholders to say, it's not that we're not going to return profit, but we're not going to return it at the sake of doing what's right for the community and right for the environment, while it's always been the opposite. We're going to do what's right for the environment and our community, as long as it's not at the sake of corporate profit. That's a huge shift in dynamic. And I think it's been understated. You don't hear a lot about it. It was a massive statement because it was a public statement. That's the kind of stuff we've always talked about behind closed doors. But to be able to make that public statement, that was a big deal. And it's one of the reasons I think Jamie is one of the better leaders out there, and he's bold and he's never afraid to make those statements. I think he's the right voice for it. But I think that's where we're getting to. And hopefully that's something we can galvanize around. But you're exactly right. We don't sit at those meetings and talk about the bad things going on in the world. It's all about making us feel good and having that emotion.
So do you think that mindset comes a bit from the rise in age for Gen Z, where they're now at that consumer level and that they've expressed that CSR stuff is something that's important to them, that they are rewarding companies that are spending more on CSR?
No, I'll be the first to tell you, Alex, take any of the generations, whether it's Generation Z or the millennials. I mean, they all get too much credit and too much blame for everything. It's the world we're living in. 30 years ago, you didn't have polar ice caps melting. When you have them melting, it's a serious situation that everybody has to take control of. And what's changed is with CSR, let's talk about sustainability. When you talk about sustainability, we had an industrial revolution. An industrial revolution, we were looking at learning how to manufacture. Nobody was worried about pollution. But fast forward 30 years later, there was a cause and effect. I mean, there was an effect to what we were able to create and build. And now we're in a world of saying, how do we pull that back? How do we change it and change the way we do things? You can't do that overnight. And I do think at times there's not enough credit for the progress. And that's something I said at the summit. Why don't you give a lot of credit to the progress that's been made? I also think there's a piece that's missing in all of this. As much as US and US companies get beat up, do you know the US has actually lowered its carbon footprint by 40%, over the last 15 years? And it's been the most progressive of any major country. Yet the US is always getting beat up of not doing enough. But here is my point. We have less than 400 million people that live in the United States. There's 8 billion people living on this planet. Until you're going to get India and China caring about sustainability like the modern world, it's just not going to have the impact. When you have 2 billion people and you've got all the manufacturing going on in China the way it's going on, until they get on board, you're not going to have the impact we need. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. That's not my point. My point is we don't have our anger where it should be. How do we get How do we get China? How do we get India? How do we get the countries with major populations, major manufacturing arms actually caring about the planet? I think that's the issue, but I do think it's contextual in time, and we tend to forget context and time. I don't think it's, to answer your question effectively, I think it's generational, not generation specific. It's generational because we're sitting here with literally what has always been frozen melting around us. If we don't admit there's a problem, we've got a problem. And I don't think you had the homelessness crisis you have today 30, 40 years ago. It's more pervasive because we have a larger population and more interesting dynamics. We didn't have an opioid crisis. Let's talk about that. We didn't have that 15 years ago, but we do today. 20 years ago, we were fighting cocaine coming into this country from Colombia. We had a drug war that was different than we have in an opioid crisis. So I think sometimes we overplay the generations versus understanding it's generational. And large populations of new generations will help us, but it's a generational problem. And it's also not unique. Like, I had the privilege of working for Lowe's Hotels for a long period of time. And, for the time that John Tisch has owned that company, and it's been over 30 years, or the Tisch family started that company, they have had a good neighbor program. That good neighbor program was a belief that we need to be good neighbors in the communities we work and live, and we need to make those communities better. Your largest corporations have always done that. It's just now become in the forefront of, this is part of our mission. It used to be something that good companies did. So I think that's what's driving it. We're just in a time frame that it's hard to ignore. And if there's any positive to social media and a 24/7 information cycle, it's that we're all aware and there's no way to ignore it. Yeah. You could probably ignore it 20 years ago because it may end up in the 5 o'clock news and then in a newspaper. But it's not something that all of a sudden there is a Twitter campaign going on against you because you've done something that's not going to be really positive for the environment. I think that's the shift. But again, to me, that's generational, not necessarily generation specific.
So how does that impact EventProfs? Sorry, Lindsay.
No, it's okay. There's so much here.
No.
Well, I think the interesting thing is for us to understand as event professionals what is important to our audience and our community. And sometimes I think it's actually more important for us to be able to explain what should be important. Sometimes what our audience is telling us is important, we have to do a better job of educating them, say, yeah, that's important, but is it more important than this? And that's something we want to talk about, I think a little more pervasively, that we don't do enough of. And it's this balance, because I don't always want to sound like I'm the counter or the contrarian, as you said earlier, but it's every time we have a show and we have a puppy adoption, program. Great, love it. We have a homeless problem sitting right outside the door. I'm glad we're adopting puppies, but how do we adopt a human being and make their life a little better at the same time?
They're just
one doesn't have to counter the other. That's not my point. So, yeah.
But I'm thinking all of a sudden of the 30 industry shows we go to a year, at least I know our staff goes to, and just thinking about the ways that, realigning the way that you would talk about the agenda and some of the things that were coming in, because we as an industry spend a tremendous amount of time showcasing the cool stuff, but I don't know. And one of the phrases that you said kept sticking with that good neighbor concept, and then EventProfs as educators. And we talk a lot about the tactics of how to do our job, but the effect and the ability and the empowerment as an event professional and the lateral, I think you said that earlier, tentacles of the ways that we literally touch everything, unless it's, meetings mean business week or global events day. I don't know that we talk about it enough. And I'm just imagining what some of those shows could look like from a global perspective if we came in as a force and really harnessed some of that messaging. I don't even know we'd all have to be on the same page, even if we all took, 10% of it around. I just think that would be a fascinating thing that I would definitely be sending all of my people to.
And Lindsay, it's what I said earlier, is that, there's too much noise.
Yeah.
And how do you get on message? What's really, really effective, and you see it right now with all the craziness in Washington, but especially during an election cycle, every single day, every Democratic strategist, every Republican strategist, they have their talking points.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if they're on radio, TV, they're being quoted in the newspaper, they are all saying the same thing. And that's why you know it's canned. That's why you know it's a talking point, because they're trying to drive a message home that starts to stick. As an industry, we need to be able to do that better.
Yeah.
We need to know that today, here is our talking point, that thousands and thousands of people in our industry are all being able to say the same thing. All the meetings taking place are hammering, and it may not be daily, it may be monthly, it may be quarterly, but we have the same message that we're trying to drive home, because I do think you're right that as event professionals, we have the largest platform to make a difference, to be heard, if we only learn how to organize that. And that's not a criticism at all of the event professional, because
we're not trained that way. We're trained to be behind stage and to take care of everyone. And I think that that's a really, you hit the nail on the head earlier. That's not our job, or traditionally has been our job. And so just what would that look like to pivot? What would take it to pivot?
And it's a delicate balance, because you have to be able to pivot and still keep your job.
Right.
So
exactly.
You still got to do the rest of that. That's your core job.
Yeah.
But how does this become more important, and how do we make it more important across the board? But I think that's where our industry organizations, I truly wish, and it's always been my hope, that they could be a little more united. They've gotten better. Meetings Means Business is a great example of that, but that is a very specific mission.
Exactly.
And Meetings Means Business.
Yeah.
How do we get a very specific mission with all the industry organizations? And like, I'm very optimistic. We have some changes going on at the Events Industry Council.
Yeah.
And I know this is the discussion point. How do you really understand what the task is as you have all those leaders and organizations sitting around a table? And how can they start to literally move and galvanize that entire audience? I'm encouraged. I think it's the right discussion being had. Don't know what the answers or the outcomes are going to be, but at least I think you have some leaders in those major roles today that are looking at what's best for the community. I've said this often, my involvement with MPI. I was an international chair. I was the head of the nomination committee when we hired Paul Van Deventer. Paul truly cares about what's good for the industry.
Yeah, he does.
And he doesn't make it about MPI.
Yeah.
He uses MPI as a platform to make the industry better. And that's what I thought was so encouraging in hiring somebody, but he came from outside our industry. He didn't bring any of that baggage or any of the territorialism that tends to exist at times, because all he cared about is how can I leverage MPI to make the industry better. It's why I think a lot of them, and that's why I support MPI so heavily, because I think they're doing those things and they're doing it for the right reasons. Yeah. And I'm not saying other organizations aren't. I just know the depth of that. I'm on the board of ASAE. I can tell you ASAE looks at the world that way.
Yeah, they do.
How do we make an impact to the industry? How do we make our industry better? And I think that's a real important time frame right now, that we have some leaders that I think are reaching across aisles to be able to get some things done. And like I said, if Washington could learn from us, we'd probably be much better off. But I think we have an opportunity to show them what that's supposed to look like. But that's us being adults as well around the table to say what's good for the industry.
Same, yeah.
So looking at 2020, how do you galvanize people around these trends and make sure that they understand how it's impacting them in the industry as a whole?
Well, I think it's important that our industry leaders reach out to the organizations that they're a part of and demand it. I think it's important to be able to say, here are the things that are most important to us. We don't tend to do that. We don't tend to talk about what are the largest social issues that we think we could tackle as an industry. But I think it's gonna come from us. The organizations tend to listen to the membership.
Yeah.
So the membership needs to get very focused. And I'm, for somebody who had to run one of those organizations, you sometimes end up with a lot of whininess about things that just aren't that important. And I think are very selfish, self-serving.
I love how honest and transparent you are. It is literally one of my favorite things about you.
Like I'm being as, I can be accused of a lot of things. Not being transparent won't be one of them. I'm just looking at the reality that some of the things that people bring up are very self-serving. And It's hard for me because I've always tended to look at you should always be looking at issues for the greater good. And if it's only self-serving, then that becomes an issue as well. So it's not an easy answer, but when Alex, you asked that question, we need some adults around the table, and adults are able to put away what's good for you. You're able to put away your own selfishness to be able to say, this is good for the industry, even if it doesn't benefit me. I think that's kind of what's missing. And I don't mean missing in that it doesn't exist. It's missing in that we need those people to have those voices.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of them there. I've met them. I'm impressed with this industry and this community. We just need them speaking up. And I don't think they don't speak up because they don't care. I think they don't speak up because they're so busy doing their job.
Yeah.
That they don't understand how important their voice is.
Right.
So if there's anything we can do for 2020, how do we let specifically senior and experienced planners know how important their voice is? Because they all work for companies that have a lot of leverage in this industry. And I think that, like, at the end of the day, that still matters.
Yeah.
If you have some leverage and you have some juice when you work for the right people. And how do we get those people to be speaking up? To be able to help us. And I think they're between a rock and a hard place because many of those corporations don't allow them to voice their opinions because they're so worried about liability. They're so worried about blowback. They're so worried about a social media campaign that's going to come at them because they make one statement. That's a delicate balance for us. The people we need to speak up sometimes can't.
Yeah.
I was on a conversation recently that was a podcast, and it was interesting that the meeting professional that was doing it with me literally did not know if they could even mention the name of the company that they work for because it has to be so separated as far as being able to speak their views about anything. And we weren't talking about anything controversial.
Yeah.
But that tells me the people that we need to be speaking up, sometimes they can't. They're a little handcuffed today. Or should I say duct taped today,
Yeah, we were at an event back in September, and there was this incredible sustainability CSR trade show installation that had gone in. And we had the planning team, they'd agreed to do it. We literally had them walking into the room for the interview, and legal pulled it. Like, she got the text as she was coming in, and like nothing was harmed, but they didn't have someone to watch the interview from press. And I was like, you just missed a huge PR opportunity for your industry. And it's only because you couldn't. I mean, there was nothing there they could have said. And I don't understand, but I guess that's small company versus large company.
It is. And look, when you work for a large company, you realize you get sued every day.
Yeah.
So part of that, being a little bit conservative is that you're trying to avert risk as much as possible. And unfortunately, we live in a litigious society. They sue for everything.
Yeah.
And that becomes the issue. And it's not even a suit. It's again, these social media campaigns that all of a sudden start to be a boycott and somebody speaking in their mind. Look at what happened in the NBA. You had an assistant general manager that spoke out about a human rights issue, and literally it became the chaos of chaos for 3 weeks.
Yep.
From one statement. And you're like, well, that's a big company and a big organization, and literally somebody that got pounded because of speaking his opinion. And I don't think anybody looked at it and saying, well, that's the NBA. He's representing the NBA. It was his own personal opinion. But it is hard to separate your personal opinion from who you work for today. And that's the reality. So it's a delicate balance because I think we agree how we get there is going to be the hard part. And I can tell you, I'm probably most thrilled. If there's anything I'm most thrilled about in working for Alhi, is that I am privately owned. I can say whatever I want to say without any blowback from the stock market or from any blowback from our stockholders. My board would be the only ones, and my board would not care that I'm being very transparent about the issues in the industry.
Right.
I think you guys know me well enough. You're never going to hear me be disrespectful or cuss or curse. It's just I have a differing opinion. And I'm okay being contrarian in that. But it makes a big difference being publicly owned versus privately owned. And it's the first time that I don't have to be really careful with everything I say because it isn't public. It's not on the street. I don't have any of that to worry about. I did in my past life, over my last 3 or 4 jobs. because if it wasn't public knowledge, it could get you into trouble for a lot of reasons. And, you didn't want any blowback that came back to a large company that becomes really a big target. It's a delicate one today. We live in a wacky world. We just really do.
So we have 2 questions left. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, so like this is the start of Mike Dominguez Unleashed, is what I'm hearing.
I'll just be interested to see if his Instagram goes from letterboards to actually something more.
God help us if that happens.
Right. So speaking of the wacky world, like the global trends, because and like I know we only have 6 minutes left, so we'll do that plus the flag. But like globally trend, we've talked a lot about the U.S., but like a lot of destinations like Hong Kong and Turkey have been, seeing all these difficulties globally, worldwide. Like there's tourism, 40% is coming down, but then there are groups that are going into Istanbul and it's completely fine. And that's just 2 examples in addition to some of the other ones. Do you think there's a global business trend as a whole, or is it still overwhelmingly positive for 2020, 2021 as we're coming in, or is it just something where we kind of have to keep an eye on it?
They're in pockets. Everything's in pockets, and you have to understand that. And it's not that different. You're talking about Turkey and Istanbul today. We were talking about Turkey and Istanbul 4 years ago when EMEC was going to be there with MPI, because they were having riots in the middle of Turkey. So it's global, global geopolitical instability. Yeah. It happens, and it just changes. You can remember Arab Spring. Yeah. 5 to 6 years ago, we're talking about Egypt and other areas. Today, we're talking about Syria and Turkey. Yeah. It just varies. Hong Kong is complicated. Hong Kong is going to be very interesting on how it gets resolved, and especially when you saw the huge Democratic vote that just took place.
That was fascinating the way it came in, because I don't think they saw it going that way. At least
and they're not paying attention, because I have a chart I show in presentations today that 10 years ago, it started 10 years ago, and it shows you how people that live in Hong Kong, whether they affiliate themselves as Chinese or as Hong Kong. Yeah. And that completely inverted literally 10 years ago, and today has the largest separation we've ever seen. Yeah. And most people see them as Hong Kongers, not Chinese. Yeah. That's the reason the vote, and if you look at that chart, the vote's not a surprise.
Well, I didn't say that the vote was a surprise, but more they were worried. Like I was talking to a couple of people who are sales of a couple of the hotels there, and they were telling me that they wanted it to. They felt the movement was there, but there was so much fear. And like the fear has always been hiding in the background. But the fact that people showed up, it was a point of pride where they said, we were surprised by the outcome, but oh, thank God, right?
And you guys are too young, but I said this, if this is 20 years ago, you have Tiananmen Square all over again. Yeah. And Beijing would have come in and shut that thing down. But if there's a positive with social media and a 24/7 information cycle, that is impossible to ever happen again. And China's had to literally walk this delicately, because the world would have to turn on them. You would have Europe that would have to turn on them if they came in and there was a violent shutdown of these protests. So I think it's very delicate. I don't think they have a choice. And this is something for a country that has always wanted to control, they can't control. Yeah. And this is the start of something, I think, bigger. It's their own Arab Spring. I don't think it's as pervasive because they can still control the mainland. But I do think over time, it opens up their eyes to what could happen in China if they don't really look at certain changes. But overall, I think they're just pockets. You're going to look at pockets around the world. Europe has been in recession in certain areas, but from a travel and events industry, it's great. And the biggest thing I think that's still going to be really positive is that the US dollar remains strong, which means many of these destinations are on sale. And being on sale is a big deal for international travel. And I think it's going to remain at least through 2020. There is no softening of the dollar in sight anytime soon.
So we only have like 2 minutes left.
I know.
I know. Questions. I'm so sorry.
I know, it's okay. It's okay because we prepped you. If you could pick one, what is your one tip for event planners?
I think the biggest tip for event planners is to be very well educated and to be aware. And here's some advice I always get asked. They're like, Mike, you say there's so much noise out there, and you hear me say that we no longer have journalists, we only have media. So people say, so what do I do? And where do I go? I say this from a newspaper's perspective, I only read the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, because the Wall Street Journal and the Times are the only two papers that end up in every C-suite in every major corporation, and it doesn't matter what the headline is. And as I always say, I love the Wall Street Journal because they do have an opinion section. It's labeled opinion. You know that you're in an opinion section and no longer news. And then during the day, the only thing I watch is CNBC, and I watch Squawk on the Street and the Squawk Market, and I watch the markets. And what I like is anything political that breaks, they break to it, they talk about it for 5 minutes, and they get back to business. I think it is important for everyone to be well educated in today's world of what's really happening. And I always tell people, it doesn't mean you have to go get a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. Follow them on Twitter, follow them on LinkedIn, because they actually aggregate the stories for you so that you can easily stay informed with what's really happening. But I think it's important for everyone to be very intuitive. And all joking aside, when you talk about my letterboards, you know, the fun part of that, I know. No, I know that. And that is what they're meant for. They're meant to be fun. They're meant to put a smile on your face. But I stay with that tone in Facebook and in Instagram. My LinkedIn account is what gets into real information that could be political, leadership driven, or industry driven. And I say that because if people want to know, I will always be trying to update on that venue or on that medium, so that they know that that's where the education is going to come from. I'll try to keep everyone in tune with what I see going on in the industry and things they should be paying attention to.
Awesome. Well, you kind of got into the resources there as well, which would have been our last question. So thank you for that.
Hold on 1 second. What was the app that you told Meta about? The daily something?
Oh, it's the Morning Brew.
Yes.
It is the best thing, and that is actually the greatest resources, one of the greatest resources. But the Morning Brew, go subscribe to it. It is a daily, it's not an app, it's a daily email. But what it does is aggregate everything that's going on in the markets and with corporations and in business, and they do it in a really fun way. But in a 5-minute read, you will be as well educated as you could possibly be.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us. This was incredible. For anyone who is not already connected to you, how can they get a hold of you, follow you, all that jazz?
Well, I'm not really hidden, so it's you can get me on LinkedIn and Facebook and definitely Instagram. And one of the things I tell people, look, everywhere I am listed, even in my LinkedIn account and Facebook account, my cell phone is there, my information is there. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, if someone says they can't get a hold of me, that's on them, because it's there. Everything's out there very publicly, because I believe that's the industry we live in.
Awesome, Mike. Well, thanks again. I hope you enjoy your holiday. And if you were watching live with us today, happy Thanksgiving. Get home to your families or your friends or whoever you're spending the holiday with. Lindsay, thank you for joining me as co-host. Mike, thank you for taking the time today. As you know, we record live each Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern at event-icons.com. The episodes are available the following Tuesday on all your favorite podcast apps. But the best place to watch is live at event-icons.com. There you can see show notes, links to all the resources shared, and join the chat right there on the page. And as always, we want to know what you think. So reach out to us on social media, contact us, tell us who you want to see on the show, what topics you want us to talk about, and we'll make sure that we schedule it. Thanks again, everybody, and we will see you next week on #EventIcons.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you for joining us for another amazing episode of #EventIcons.
To catch all the bonus content, resources mentioned, and an invite to our Facebook and LinkedIn groups,
Head to www.event-icons.com. Also, let us know what you thought about this week's episode. Share your biggest takeaway. Just tag your post with #EventIcons. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on #EventIcons.